Hi, I'm Greg Farrar, and this is my almost daily, sometimes every other day, and I think this time actually every third day, COVID-19 Trends live stream. So I didn't actually do anything yesterday. Often I put a text version on Facebook on the days between live streams. I think I did do it 2 days ago, the last actual YouTube live stream, but yesterday I spent hours going over these graphs, following on what I talked about on Friday, trying to get better legends to the right, trying to sort things better so that I wasn't consistently sorting by total cases per day. I wanted to get sorting orders that made more sense for the particular graphs they belong to. This had a lot of unexpected consequences. So I think I've somewhat stabilized today in a place that's a little more reasonable, but this is definitely still a work in progress, as always. There's at least one new graph here, and I'll talk in particular. I've got two rope charts now for each category. Two charts showing growth over by day, by country, state, and county, and I'll explain why that is shortly. So, as usual, I'll do the countries of the world, the states of the United States, and the counties of California. So here we go. This graph looks the same as always. This is the total cases. The United States massively in the lead as always, followed by Brazil, and now Russia, which Brazil has long since passed Russia. And then there's everyone else. But these are the total numbers. I do like to work on per capita basis. These are the total numbers per day. The Brazil here again passing Russia. Brazil passing the United States, and India passing Russia. Okay, yeah, this is the first graph that shows a somewhat different than what we've seen a few days ago. I think 2 days ago I switched this one over so that Brazil was at the top. So you notice the legend is different on the first graph. We have these United States, Brazil, Russia, and then in this we have Brazil, United States, India, Russia. So this is actually sorted in a way that kind of mostly aligns with how the lines show up on the graph. So Brazil, United States, India, Russia, whereas before I was trying to keep the graph labels, the legend, always the same between graphs, so we'd always have the same color line for the United States. We no longer have consistent coloration, but now the legend to the right gives a better sense of what we're seeing in the graph itself. But as I said, I like the per capita numbers best, the daily cases per million, and so let's move on to the third graph where I spend most of my time. Now this graph is radically different in some ways than it used to be. 2 days ago, you did not see all these same countries, because what we were doing 2 days ago is I was taking the countries with the most cases per day and saying those are the important ones, and then of those, the 25 countries with the most cases per day, how many cases do they have per million? In this case, for the most part, I've switched over to just saying what are the hot spots in cases per million, daily cases per million. Not total, but daily cases per million. And this brings in potentially a lot of smaller countries. Here we see that things like France is gone, Germany's gone, Italy and Spain, they're gone. Those countries do not have that many cases anymore at all, but they certainly don't have that many cases per million. And instead, we're bringing in some countries that are smaller, but that are hotter in terms of daily cases per million. So, but on the other hand, I didn't just want to have it go so far in this direction that the whole graph was full of island nations with population of 2 that suddenly had their first case, and now it looks like they have 500,000 cases per million today. So I did put a limit on how small I'd go. I didn't want to. The first attempt at this was showing some countries I'd never heard of. In this case, I've heard of at least most of the countries in this list, all but maybe 1 or 2. And I've done a little geography studies to recognize, what is Gabon? I'm afraid I didn't know that one before, but I do now. But on the other hand, these are not the very smallest countries. Some of them when you get into the very small populations, you can get outliers that are extremely high but don't have any kind of effect on the world numbers. And so, should I be showing those? Should I not? I'm looking for a mid-ground here. On the bright side, it's not like we're only seeing the outliers on this graph. We see, for instance, the United States. We see Russia. But when you look at the top, and at the top, by the way, we still see Qatar, which we've always seen as our dominant player in DCPM, daily cases per million. And we see Chile and Peru and a lot of other countries that we've seen, but about half of these are new. These are the countries that don't have enough total daily cases to show in the top 25, but that are serious hotspots in the world. So Qatar still is the leader with 700. Again, anything over 500 I consider a hotspot. Qatar is the only hotspot. Even when we do this adjustment, it is the only hotspot. But Bahrain at 300 is pretty hot, pretty warm. Chile is ahead of Brazil, interestingly, as almost 300 daily cases per million hotspot. And then we see Kuwait, which is dropping away, but is definitely more than warm. Warm are the ones that are over 100. And so going from the top down, the hot spots of the world are just Qatar. The warm spots of the world are Bahrain, Chile, Kuwait, Peru, Armenia. That's new now that we've changed these things around. That was not on our list before. Oman, also new, and Brazil. I think maybe just barely. We have Panama. Yeah, we have Panama. And everything else, nothing else is warm even. Nothing else even has 100 daily cases per million. Now, in the days of when Italy had this pandemic, we were seeing 300, 400, 500, 600 daily cases per million from places like Italy and Spain. No longer. Europe has recovered. I think Sweden still shows up here. Sweden, with its lesser lockdown, interestingly, still shows up here. But for the most part, Europe has recovered so much that it doesn't show up here, and it doesn't even, does it show up in the total daily cases, new daily cases? Not even adjusted for population. Yeah, also not, even though they're much bigger than some of these countries. Do we have, other than Sweden and Turkey, which always shows up kind of as an honorary member of Europe in these reports, we see that Europe has recovered. Now, the United States still prominently showing up here, Russia is still prominently showing up here, but neither of them are hot. I'll look at the United States, still hanging out there at 60 daily cases per million versus, say, 600 plus for Qatar, or even for Bahrain and Chile. We've got, again, these numbers in the hundreds, but United States not in that range. United States is rather cool compared to the other countries in the hotspot sense, in the sense of daily cases per million. All right, moving on to the next graph, my favorite graph, the rope chart. This rope chart is no longer quite what it used to be, and I've changed the title and added another one that you'll see in a minute to indicate this. This is now breaking down, it's taking just the top daily cases per million countries, the ones that we saw in the previous graph, and it's showing how much are they growing. So this is the growth of the DCPM leaders. And when you look at that, so another way of putting it is, of the current hardest hit countries, adjusted for population, which are the hottest in terms of growth? And here we see Macedonia very high, but also relatively small. Panama, again, part of the Central South America cluster. Oman, these are quite high in their growth rates. Macedonia is extraordinarily high at 17%. The rest under 10%, but still, that's anything over 5%. I've been calling a hot spot. So roughly Armenia, Colombia, all these new ones we weren't reporting before. South America, Africa, Panama and Macedonia, which is another way of saying there are no large countries that are current hotspots. No major high population countries are currently hotspots worldwide for the COVID-19 pandemic, which is good news. The hotspots do exist, but they're all in these somewhat smaller countries, and possibly even smaller countries that I'm not even reporting on here because they're so small that it seems like I don't know that my listenership is going to be interested in the numbers for specific island nations. These are substantial countries, over 1 million in population, and hotspots. In one case, a very high hotspot. When we look at, well, actually, let's take a moment and look at the position of the zero line here. The zero line, the question of whether countries are growing or shrinking in new cases, is towards the bottom of our rope. And there are very few countries actually that are shrinking right now. This is not a good thing. Of the hotspots, in the daily cases hotspots, many of them are also at least warm spots in terms of growth, which is a bad combination. So there are a lot of countries that are warm to hot in terms of, well, they're not necessarily warm to hot because they're in the top 20 in daily cases per million. Again, a lot of these are in this cluster down here that don't have a huge number of daily cases per million. But of the ones, they're still in the top 25 worldwide in that sense. So of the top 25 worldwide, we see that many of them are warm, like this one at 2%. Moldova at 2%. And but on the other hand, the United States, Russia, the big countries, the really big countries, Sweden. Well, Sweden's growing, but the really big countries are not the hottest ones. The biggest countries tend to be shrinking or holding even right now, and that's certainly the case for the United States. The United States is around 0. It's not warm. It's certainly not hot. The hot spots are these few small countries. So what does it mean? I interpret this as saying that the biggest countries of the world are mostly recovering. There are exceptions. You may want to focus on the Central South America cluster. They've recovered to the point that the only news here is in some of the smallest countries. Let's look at Central South America. And actually, let's look at America as a whole. Chile, Brazil, Peru, Panama, United States. Canada? Is Canada here? No, Canada didn't make this graph, so Canada is not in the top 25 in daily cases per million. But all these other locations, many other locations, Puerto Rico, interestingly showing up here. I think it also shows up in the states report. Let's see, Dominican Republic, Colombia. Is that it? I think that's it among this list. I think so. So that's a lot. That's a lot of states, a lot of nation states, a lot of countries. 8 of the top 25 in daily cases per million are in America. And let me link United States here so we can see that the only one, let me just look up Dominican Republic and make sure I'm not making a mistake here about where that is. My sense is that's one of those. That's like the other half of Haiti. Yeah, that is. I learn geography as I do this. But yes, the Dominican Republic is it is the other half of the island that contains Haiti. It is, I don't know whether that's technically Central South America, but it's part of this general cluster. It's one of the islands over by Cuba and so on. And Dominican Republic is the only of these that is actually shrinking. All the other countries of Central South America that are have a high enough daily case per million to be on the top 25 list to begin with, they are all growing, including the United States, though it's just barely growing, 0.3%, and a couple of other ones, Puerto Rico and Chile, both looking pretty good, especially Chile trending downwards. And then the hotter ones are Brazil, Peru, Colombia, and Panama. So there is a generally warm / hot spot in especially Central South America, but also a little bit in North America, touching on North America. And that continues. That's still, the news still says we have a hot spot in Central South America, and there it is. However, there are kind of a lot of names missing from this list. Where is Europe? Where is Canada? Where is Australia? Where is China? And I decided that I would put a new graph together, still a rope chart, a very busy rope chart, that just lists all the countries, just to give us a sense of how is the world as a whole going, not subject to this initial filter of which of them already have it bad, which of them are bad in a daily cases per million perspective, but let's just look at all the countries. So this is really busy. I'm not going to be able to take much out of it, but it does mean that if you're in the chat and if you want to listen, you want to see a particular country, I can show it to you here. Which countries are doing better, are growing, and which ones are shrinking without regard to how many cases they actually have. Lots of cases, few cases, everyone is here. And they're alphabetical, by the way, because it's not an obvious way to sort these. So United States, for instance, as we've seen, tiny. And I mentioned, for instance, Italy. How is Italy doing? Let's find it. Italy is doing quite well at a 4% drop per day. And it's already come so far that it's just not even on the radar anymore. What about Canada? Also doing very well. 4% drop per day and dropping. If we look at the whole list then, if we look at all of them, the rope chart centers at 0. And as I mentioned, this rope chart here, the one above, does not center at 0, not remotely. It is growing. It looks pretty bad as a rope chart. But what this tells us is that the countries that are worst in daily cases per million haven't peaked. For the most part, they're still getting worse. Those countries that are in the top 25 in their daily cases per million number are also growing, which is a kind of a bad combination, but that's how it is. Whereas the ones that are just generically no filter on whether they're good or bad in daily cases per million, countries as a whole are roughly split on whether they're growing or shrinking, maybe a little above 0, but they don't look as bad. It doesn't look as bad when we look at countries as a whole. There are about as many that are shrinking as that are growing. The very worst in the world, by the way, is Libya. The very best in the world is South Sudan. And we would kind of expect countries that we haven't talked about a lot to be the best or the worst, because that's how it works. Outliers tend to be in the smaller, less hit areas. But when we actually filter this to filter out all the countries that don't make a difference so much because they're not in the daily cases per million, that's when we get this graph where we see a lot of the countries that we've heard about being particularly problematic, like Russia or Iran. I didn't really focus on Iran, but Iran is looking pretty bad at 3% growth. And again, just to make this graph, you have to have a relatively high daily cases per million. And then the United States, it would perfectly be possible that the United States would not be in this graph. Canada isn't, but the United States is bad enough in daily cases per million. As we see here in daily cases per million, United States, it's not even warm in the sense of being at 100 daily cases per million, but it's certainly not one of the many, many stone-cold countries of the world. It's there, it's visible, it's in this cluster down here at the bottom, but it's not one of the many, many countries we see here that are just not hit that hard right now by the coronavirus. The United States is in the top 25 of all countries in terms of how much is affected by coronavirus. So we'll keep watching this. We will especially watch this. We'll see if these shift around into I might decide to raise the bar a little bit more in terms of how small I consider. But 1 million is a substantial country, and these countries are the ones that are over 1 million in population and the highest in DCPM. So being in the United States, it is a little alarming that the United States is in the middle of this pack, rubbing elbows with the likes of Russia and the UAE, which we knew had a problem, and Panama, or the Central South America cluster. The United States really is not over this thing, not looking very good, but not looking terrible, as I often emphasize, not even at 100 DCPM. So We'll keep an eye on all of these as we go forward. Let me switch to the analysis of, let's pass over the deaths as usual, and look at population tested. Qatar, the best testing, the testing is pretty good. These are probably testing, no, this is testing based on the, here again, the order is changed to the right here. This is simply the 50 best. No, it isn't, actually. I think this is these are the top 20, this is an evolving set of graphs, but the cases, total cases per day, and how many tests has been done. So this doesn't show, for instance, actually, I'm going to need to look into what this sort order here really is. The United States at the top suggests that it's in total cases per day or in total cases overall. And I think it's total cases per day. But I think the more interesting sort here would be to just do it the way the graph does it, to say Qatar is the best in population tested, Russia's next, Italy's next, Belgium, and then only then do we get to the United States. The United States doing very well, really, though, at 5% of its population tested so far, pushing, it's close to Qatar, close to Russia and Italy and Belgium. So the United States is really a world leader in coronavirus testing, as it needs to be, since it's also a world leader in coronavirus cases. Which is, again, not to say that there's a dire problem here. It's just that nobody anymore has this thing terribly. And so when we look at the leaders, we get places, even like the United States, with only 60 dCPM showing up on our graphs. Population tested per day, it is worth noting, there are only 2 countries that are really doing well above that 0.15% metric, but the United States is close. The United States as a whole is very close, days away from reaching 0.15%, which is the metric set by California, for instance, as a very good bar. So we're not seeing that, we're not seeing many countries doing as well as the United States, and the United States is just roaring upwards in its testing capacity, doing much better than everyone else. So that's some more good news for the US. Briefly, I'll just say, we've talked about how great Iceland does, with 18% of its population tested well. Bahrain, actually, Luxembourg, Lithuania, Denmark, there are some other ones that are doing very well, but Bahrain is the current leader in total population tested, percent of population tested. Let's move to the states. Here again, and here we'll see the same sort of effect, where some states that haven't been as much in my reports are bubbling to the top, because I'm focusing on each graph on what's highest in that graph, not just the total number of daily cases. So New York, New Jersey, as always, Illinois, but shrinking, California, Massachusetts. These are the total cases leaders. Total cases, though, I think are less interesting than daily cases, and best of all are the daily cases per million. So let's just move on to that graph. Now this graph looks great in some ways. We see all the first wave they've just shot downward. They're not warm, they're certainly not hot. New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, the northeast of the United States, which was certainly a hotspot region, has recovered. So that's good. So who hasn't recovered? Well, I'll also point out that now the ordering of this graph, the legend, is actually roughly, it's kind of hard to make it match the lines, because the lines are this very complicated algorithm that do this nonlinear fit of all the data. And what's really happening on the legend here is it's looking at the last 7 days and saying who has had the most daily cases per million over the last week. Rhode Island, interestingly, is there, which is interesting, especially because if you look at Rhode Island's graph, it doesn't seem like it's a leader here. It's shooting downward. But if you zoom out, Rhode Island has had these very strange data points, which are probably correct because they're not so outrageous as to be not correct. But a few of the days recently, it's had DCPM in the 16, 17, 1800 range. And that's extraordinarily high. Rhode Island has been reporting extraordinarily high numbers, and we know that Rhode Island was very high anyway. So these probably are right. It's somehow catching up with its very high testing numbers. It's catching up with what appears to be a very high infection rate. But lately, not so much. This is 4 or 5, 6 days ago that it was like that, and so this brings Rhode Island to the top. But the trend line still doesn't quite believe it. There are a lot of data points that are headed more downward, and so those are kind of outliers. They're probably correct in terms of actually having a lot of new cases, but the trend line still thinks things are headed downward here for Rhode Island. We'll see. Maybe it will turn around suddenly. But if you look at the very latest data for Rhode Island, it's much more back to where it's always been, in the 100 range. It's warm, but still cooling. Michigan, similarly, if I recall. Michigan has some outrageous, no, these aren't quite so outrageous, but it has some very high numbers in daily cases per million for certain recent days. 400, 500. This makes Michigan arguably a hot spot. It's got a day where it's a hot spot, which is strange because mostly it's well below 100. It's had some hot spot days. But for the most part, Michigan isn't even warm at 100. So is it a hot spot or not even warm? Well, you decide. The graph argues with itself on this point. Massachusetts, third on our list, seems to have turned the corner into no longer even being cool. It was at 100, 200, 300. It was pretty warm, but now it seems to have cooled down. But again, with some recent days that are in the 600 range, it's had some hot single weeks. Maryland actually is warm. It's at 150 and steady. Arizona is looking pretty bad with this real cluster of relatively high points, 160s, 200s, not hot, but warm for sure. Nebraska, also a warm spot, slightly declining. Georgia, like the others, has some very high numbers on certain days, 400, 500, so it's had some bad days. But the trend seems to be that it's not even a warm spot and it's stable. And Utah, not looking so good. A sharp upward trend for a few days now. Enough that I'd really call this a trend. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 days where it's gone upward. Now showing 180, which makes it definitely a warm spot. And sharply upward. We'll see if that continues. Iowa's pretty stable, but is slightly warm. Arkansas heading upwards. It gets down to where? California. You've got to go down to the 25th of the states before you find California. California at 60. Not cold, but it doesn't qualify as a warm spot at 60, but it's still rising. This is not a good trend for California, but it doesn't have very many cases overall by population. In a DCPM, daily cases per million sense, California does not have many cases, but it certainly is not trending downward. So the cases are rising. We see this one day, a couple days ago, where it had 92 DCPM. That's almost enough to say that it's warm. It's certainly warming up, according to this. But many of the states we talk about, like where's Colorado? Colorado doesn't even qualify on this graph anymore. It used to qualify because it had a fair number of daily cases total, but now this graph you qualify for this graph by having a high daily cases per million. Colorado doesn't. Texas doesn't even figure on this, and that's a good thing. Anytime someone doesn't count in this graph, doesn't qualify, that's a good thing. Ohio isn't here. Florida isn't here. So what we are kind of seeing here is the first wave of the Northeast, we got over it. The second wave, places like Michigan, Illinois, Louisiana, well, some of those are still here. Let's look at Illinois and Louisiana, but we've seen a lot of recovery in some of those states. Michigan isn't even, no, yes it is, sorry. Let's look at the second wave states. I think what we're going to see is they're recovering. The second wave, Michigan, Illinois, Louisiana, are trending downwards. Maybe not so much Louisiana, but none of them are even warm anymore. They were, but they're not anymore. So now we see the third wave, which is this very diffuse wave running over states like, I don't know, Arizona, and it's kind of the middle of the country in some cases. Nebraska, Georgia, maybe Georgia, we've already looked at as kind of flat. We have this diffuse wave of lukewarm activity and some actually warm activity. But what's warm is mostly declining, maybe not so much in Minnesota, Iowa, and Virginia, but a lot of states have growing cases. You can see what seems to be sort of a mini rope here, from about here up to about here. This rising trend in maybe 10 or 15 states, but none of them very hard hit yet. Now, if that trend continues, they could end up at 100, 200, 500. We'll see. But at this point, the growth rate is slow. As with the countries, I have two rope charts now. I've got the rope charts that are just the high DCPM states. The previous graph, in other words, represented as a growth chart, as a rope chart, showing their growth rates. This chart, unlike the countries, actually looks quite good. Of the high daily cases per million states, the majority appear to be below zero, slight majority, but I think that's a majority. So the hottest states, again, nothing's really hot right now, but of the hottest states, the lukewarm ones, in other words, the ones that aren't cold, most of them are dropping. Some of them are rising, but most, maybe 60% or more, are dropping. The ones that are rising are Utah, South Carolina, Arizona, North Carolina, California, Tennessee. Alabama is rising in new cases, but the trend line is downward, so it's about to hit zero and level out. All the rest of those states we just saw in the previous graph are dropping, and most of them are accelerating. So this graph looks pretty good. Worth noting that California is currently seeing a 2% growth. So California it's got a unfortunate combination of characteristics. It has enough cases to qualify for the top 25 states in DCPM, daily cases per million, and it is growing at about 2%, and it's even slightly accelerating. So we're going to keep an eye on California. Not looking good, but it's not one of these. It's not Utah with 7% or Arizona with 6%. It's just got 2%. So then I did the rope chart of the whole country. Not quite as busy because there are not nearly as many states as there are countries. And so here we could actually potentially zoom in on any of these. So first of all, just look at the broad range. From the top, Utah again, the worst in growth. Michigan, the best in growth. Delaware is looking good. Illinois, Texas, looking pretty good, I think. Is that Texas? I'm going to zoom in on some of I know that I have with a relatively small viewership here, I can zoom in on the states that I know that my viewership cares most about. Let us look at a subset of states that are chosen just based on what I think that the people listening care most about. Put it in the chat if you want to see another one. That may be all of them. Did I put California in there? Yeah. So, where's my chat? Okay, nothing in chat yet. It's about a mix. It's a mix. So we've got Texas and California exactly tied with 2% and very slightly rising. So not good. We don't want to see that, but at least it's only 2%. Louisiana with 1% and very slightly rising. Colorado is now trending upwards again and has turned the corner back towards positive growth. We'll watch and see if that continues, but right now it's pretty close to zero growth. Georgia is dropping and accelerating, Ohio dropping, accelerating, Michigan dropping and accelerating. Seems like there are some other states that I ought to mention in here. I don't know. I'll just again look at the whole road chart. All the road chart is kind of good. It's kind of good. More states, I think, are below zero than above, or at least it's even. It's at least not showing this trend to have a whole lot of states above zero and very few below that we've sometimes seen. So when we look at all 50 states, the trend is at least balanced. The news isn't bad. Whereas when we look at the worst hit states, the trend is, I'd say, slightly even good. So maybe we're starting to see, just as today, just with these new graphs, a trend towards the United States as a whole turning that corner and heading towards negative growth. But again, this has absolutely no consideration for whether the states have a lot of people or not. It doesn't matter whether they have a lot of people, but it has no consideration about whether they have a lot of people or not. It doesn't care about whether they're hot or warm in a daily cases sense. So some of these lines could be states that had 10 cases yesterday and they have 9 today. So that's a huge drop. I will say that no one is above 7%, no one is below 9% in the entire nation, and that's pretty good. We've got a bracketing there that's not too extreme. We aren't seeing any 20%. Looking at testing, these are all the states again. Testing is led by Rhode Island, as always, home of CVS Pharmacy. New York is really doing well in testing. A few others, I can't really see them easily. North Dakota, Massachusetts. Bottom line is the United States is doing great in testing. When I started this, I was originally saying 0.4% tested, 0.8% tested is good. 1% is world-class testing. At this point, the very worst state is doing 3%. So the United States is testing like gangbusters. And that can only do good things, I think. In terms of testing per day, all these states are heading upwards, also looking great. The testing is really these are all the states now, so I may not be able to focus in as I do to list which states are actually doing. I can't list them all, there's just not time. New York and Rhode Island are accelerating, they're still in the top per day. I will briefly try to zoom in on those that are testing more than 0.15% of the population a day. These are the ones that meet California's requirement of opening if they were a county. So it's generally a standard to say they're doing well in their testing, very well, I'd even say, in their testing. New York, Rhode Island, New Mexico, New Jersey, Alaska, District of Columbia, Connecticut, Wisconsin, Illinois, Louisiana, all doing very well. I'm going to focus in on some of those states. I wish I just had a gang switch that said, what are the states that my viewers most care about? And by the way, if I don't, I certainly don't know all of you. So if there's a state you care about, you can put it on my radar. But just by sending me a message or commenting on this video, and I will try to include it in sort of a focus. No, that's all right. Thought I lost for a minute my lines. I don't want to spend too much time manually looking through this list and saying who might care about this. Who do I know who lives in this state? But Colorado and California are the top two. All right, well, that may not be everyone, but let's just take a look at this small subset. The only ones in our subset that are doing great are Michigan and California. Very notable, California as a whole has crossed 0.15%, which is its own standard for when a county is doing well enough to consider opening. California is doing very well. Florida is in Georgia at 0.1, Ohio and Texas at 0.6. Texas doing rather poorly in daily testing, But if you look at the whole range, we certainly have others doing worse. Not many though. Texas, you're doing terrible. Texas is in the bottom 10 certainly in the daily number tested by percent. So Texas needs to pick that up, especially because Texas does show up in some of these other graphs. Let's just take a look where Texas goes again in daily cases per million, which is, I think, the graph. If there's one graph, I used to love the rope chart most. Now I love the daily cases per million chart most. Never mind, Texas isn't even in the daily cases per million, so that's good. Texas is doing very well per capita. And if we look at it in terms of its growth, which we did before, it's growing, but it's growing from a position that's right now quite low. Texas has very few cases. Texas is doing well. So it also isn't testing very well, but maybe it doesn't need to. It's doing fine. It should do fine with the testing rate that it's going at, I think. All right, moving to the counties of California. So Los Angeles in total cases, of course, blows the doors off California. No one has anything like it. 60,000, where the next competitor is around 8,000. But the next competitor is Riverside. I know that there are some of my occasional listeners or interested people who care about Riverside. It still has the most cases. San Diego's trying, but not reaching there. Orange, San Bernardino, Alameda, and then the noise. Everyone else is kind of noise. And that, again, is in total, which is, I think, less valuable information than the population-adjusted figures. And again, daily cases per million, Los Angeles in total is just dominating. Everyone else is noise. But Los Angeles is huge. So it is at least possible that Los Angeles would have a lot more cases than anyone else and still be doing much better on a population adjusted basis. Is that true? Well, yes. I was going to say, no, there's the blue line. That's Los Angeles. Yes, that actually is true. Los Angeles is doing well once you adjust for population. And this Imperial is the problem child when it comes to daily cases per million. Here I have adjusted maybe I should just briefly go back. Nah, I'm not going to bother. To say my graphs are now being sorted. The list on the right is being sorted by DCPM, by daily cases per million. So we see Imperial on the top, and then Kings, just like it appears in the graph. And then Los Angeles. No, not Los Angeles. It is Los Angeles. Okay, and this is where the sorting order, again, I can't sort by where the lines appear, and so I'm sorting by DCPM, the sum of DCPM, or the average of the DCPM over the past 7 days. And Los Angeles actually is 5th when it comes in there. The trend line shows higher. The trend line, we really almost have two different reports here. There's the one on the right, which is the list that says Los Angeles is 5th, and then there's this guess of the trend that's made by the trend line algorithm, which says Los Angeles is 3rd. These two will conflict, and there's nothing I can really do about that. Pick your algorithm. Do you think it's more relevant that the curve roughly fitting the dots goes about like this, or is it better to say that the last 7 days Los Angeles was actually in 5th place? They tend to be fairly close. But Los Angeles is a problem. It's certainly a problem. According to this trend line, it's at 125 in daily cases per million. That makes it a warm spot. The only other warm spot is Kings, and then there's the hot spot Imperial, which continues to be extraordinarily hard hit with 700 DCPM. We don't see numbers like that normally. Going a little bit farther down the list, Kern, Marin, San Bernardino, San Mateo. Takes this far to get to the Bay Area. San Mateo at San Francisco Bay Area at 50. Orange, Alameda also. So the Bay Area, there's nothing warm in the Bay Area. Maybe lukewarm at 50, but Bay Area is doing pretty good. Monterey is rising in prominence. surprisingly. Monterey is here. It's not hot, it's not warm, it's at 40, but its slope is higher, is faster than everyone else. So we're starting to hear more about Monterey in these reports. So that, again, there's not much to say about the counties of California in DCPM. There's Imperial, there's Kings, there's Los Angeles, and there's noise. The rest is all noise. Now, if we here, as with the other two, I have taken the DCPM report, just the top 25 in daily cases per million, the hardest hit counties adjusted by population, and said, who's growing? Well, Madera apparently is. This is a big number, 18% growth per day. Madera County, I just look it up. I looked this up before. 160,000, not super huge. I believe that I did, as with countries, cut out some of the smallest counties. I think I put my cutoff at 100,000 because otherwise we would have had some. There are some very small counties in California that are growing faster than this and that have a DCPM higher than this, but I just didn't want to include them in my report because I don't think I have any listeners from there, and I don't know that anyone that's listening cares about these tiny counties. So I took them out. If you want to know about them, they will be on the next page here, but yeah, I didn't include them in the DCPM report at least. So Madera, San Joaquin, sometimes I've included that, I believe, as almost the Bay Area, and Monterey, also included as almost the San Francisco Bay Area. Monterey is growing at 7% a day. That's a very high growth rate. San Joaquin at 8%. So these are very problematic in growth rates, especially given that they made this graph by being relatively high in daily cases per million. So these are a couple of pretty problematic counties right now. Monterey is right next door to where I am right now. So here in Santa Cruz, I would say we are worried to see our neighbor heating up like this. That said, none of these are warm spots even. They're cool, they're heating, but they're not, at this point, hot enough to worry about. San Bernardino, Kern, and others. And I'd say noise. The best, and here again, it's worth noting the positioning of our zero line here. These are all the counties that are hottest, not to say hot, because almost none of them are even warm, but the counties that make this report are the ones that have the highest DCPM of the state, and those counties are almost all above zero. So the ones that are warm are warming up, and some of them are accelerating in their warm, so they're getting warmer. So this is a troubling number here, to be kept in the context of the fact that California as a whole is not a serious hotspot, but it's showing a trend in that direction. It would be weeks before I think it would even become a warmer hotspot, months even, and I think it's probably, my guess from what I've seen of other graphs, is going to recover before then. But there is a trend upwards in California. We're not seeing a recovery, we're seeing an acceleration. By the way, here's Imperial, our hottest of all, which I'm pleased to say has turned the corner and is now actually a cooling spot in terms of its growth rate. So Imperial, with that those crazy numbers, probably caused by people from living in Mexico coming to get treatment in Imperial, that appears to have peaked, turned the corner, and is headed south. And as we always see this. Places heat up, they peak, and they drop away. And Imperial has done that. It is now cooling down. I'm going to move on here to show the whole state rope chart. I'm already really over the time I wanted to go. Madera, again at the top. Humboldt, actually, oddly, at the bottom with a 10% drop. I'll focus here, well, maybe just look at a few. Sutter, Placer, San Joaquin again, Monterey again. So even when we include all the counties, San Joaquin and Monterey are dominant in their growth rates. There are a lot of counties here in this warm plus range. 0.1% growth is warm. There are a lot of warm counties in terms of growth rate in California right now, which is not good, but again, don't worry yet because none of them have very many cases. If this continues, we could have a problem. At this point, I'm just noting they're heating up. They're heating up from a place that's already quite cool, but this is certainly not the growth trajectory we'd like to see for all these counties. A lot of counties are heating up. I'll show Santa Cruz since I can. Now, Santa Cruz has just fallen off the radar because it had so few cases, but worth mentioning, Santa Cruz is cooling. Santa Cruz is looking quite good with a 2% daily decrease in growth rate, and it's been steady there for a long time. It's never had very many cases. Maybe since I also can do this, I'll try to pick out so many counties here. I'm going to try to pick out the San Francisco Bay Area, the Silicon Valley area. I think I'm missing one, Santa Clara at least. That might be all of them. The San Francisco Bay Area, Santa Cruz is by far the best. San Francisco is doing okay, holding steady. San Mateo is doing okay. It's quite holding steady. 0, no growth for San Francisco, but it's been better. San Mateo is also not growing in new cases. That's good, and it's trending downward. Also good. At Alameda and Santa Clara, both growing slightly. They're warm spots for sure at 2 and 3%. And then San Joaquin is that hot spot and accelerating. San Joaquin is looking the worst of all of these. But worth mentioning, no, not worth mentioning. San Joaquin, interesting. I thought we were going to find that it didn't have many cases. Just to get a sense of what I mean when I say that something's not in serious trouble. San Joaquin, yes, it's accelerating. Yes, it's a hot spot in terms of growth. Yes, it's even accelerating in that. But its DCPM is 14. Remember, we've been seeing 600 in some cases. 500 to be a hot spot. It's 14. It will take it a long time, even at 7%, to even become warm at 100. Now you can see all these dots up here, where one dot barely passed one day past the cool spot mark. But we have a lot of counties in California right now that look kind of like this. They have very few cases by population, but their cases are accelerating. Will they accelerate for another? And they'd have to accelerate for weeks and weeks and weeks to even be warm. So will that happen? We'll see. Right now, overall, no cause for alarm, but the trends are not the direction we wish they were. Population, percent tested by population. We'll look briefly at this. Daily, I'll just go to the daily, sure. There are several counties that are doing quite well in testing. We have Marin, Los Angeles, Imperial, San Francisco, and Kings. Some of the hardest hit counties, those two, Kings and Imperial, also have the very best testing rate. So they probably noticed they were hard hit, picked up their testing seriously, and they're doing very well in testing. Maybe worth mentioning that even the worst county is testing 2.5%, which is a very good testing rate. So testing across California, those who've been with me from the beginning will remember I was just miserably down on California's testing for weeks after I started doing this. We are long past that point. California's testing is now great, and it continues to be great. And I, who have no symptoms and no super strong reason to think I might have the virus, was able to walk in a couple days ago to a random place and get tested for free. So can anyone, I think. And so California is doing very well in testing. That, I think, will pull us out of this. So broadly, California does have it has a trend in the wrong direction, but it's doing well nevertheless because its cases are so low. And I'd say the news overall, the sense of the news overall from today's report is good. California, growth trend in the wrong direction, but very few cases. At the state level, we have very few warm spots. Well, we have a few warm spots. No hot spots, no super warm spots. And the growth is okay. It's kind of a mixed bag for the states. It's looking okay. Nothing to run screaming about. And at the country's level, to reiterate, we have, no, not that. Oh, those are the deaths graphs. See if I can get back. Yeah, overall, the world is stable. About as many countries are growing as are shrinking. However, those countries that are worst hit right now are growing. They tend to be growing even more. However, there are very few countries that are really hard hit right now. And that's the news today. Thanks for watching. Tomorrow I'll probably post a textual summary and hopefully be back in 2 days with